Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to have a discussion with Maya Ragu and Andrea Johnson on the topics of pay equity, legislative trends, pay equity, pay data reporting, and pay equity audits. Maya is Director of Workplace Equity and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center. She leads development of and advocacy on federal legislative and regulatory initiatives, public education and stakeholder engagement, and impact litigation on a range of issues addressing women's economic security and equality, including equal pay, harassment, and civil rights enforcement. Prior to joining the center, Maya was senior attorney at Futures Without Violence and a senior staff attorney at Legal Momentum, formerly now Legal Defense and Education Fund, focusing on economic security, gender discrimination, and gender-based violence with an emphasis on immigrant and low-income women. Maya's work encompassed litigation, legislative and policy advocacy, public education and training, multi-sector initiatives, and cross-movement collaboration. Maya was previously an associate at Simpson Thacher and a law clerk to the Honorable Vanessa Gilmore of the Southern District of Texas. She's a graduate of Trinity University and Georgetown University Law Center. Maya frequently speaks and writes about issues related to women's equality and economic security and has appeared in a number of media outlets. Andrea is Director of State Policy, Workplace Justice, and Cross-Cutting Initiatives at the National Women's Law Center. In that role, Andrea coordinates efforts to advance state policies across the center's workplace justice, income security, education, and reproductive rights and health teams, while working directly on legislation related to pay discrimination, sexual harassment, and pregnancy discrimination. Prior to joining the center, Andrea was a law clerk to the Honorable Colleen Codaly on the U.S. District Court for D.C. and the Honorable Eric Washington, Chief Justice of the D.C. Court of Appeals. Andrea served as a legislative aide to Congresswoman Betty McCollum from Minnesota prior to law school. Andrea received a law degree from Columbia Law School and a bachelor's degree in political science and French from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. I am Joanna Kim Brunetti. I am VP of Regulatory Affairs. I provide regulatory and legislative oversight to Trusaic's product and service lines, including diversity-related and pay equity analytics and auditing and pay data reporting. I have frequently spoken and written on topics including pay data auditing and reporting, as well as other issues relating to pay equity and diversity. I'm a former partner with Aiken Gump with over 20 years of experience advising clients. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering from UC Berkeley and a JD from Loyola Law School with honors. I was president of the Korean American Bar Association and also co-chair of various subcommittees under the ABA and the Los Angeles County Bar Association. So with that introduction, let's first lay out the problem to provide the backdrop for our discussion today. Probably not surprisingly, based on U.S. Census data, the Economic Policy Institute in 2020 found that on average, men are paid more than women at every educational level. Okay, not a surprising finding. Perhaps slightly more surprising is the fact that this inequity gets worse as you move up the educational ladder for jobs starting from the post-high school graduate positions. And then when you consider the pay gap along racial or ethnicity lines, the same troubling trend is shown. On average, white workers are paid more than Black and Hispanic workers at every educational level. And the problem, again, is just getting worse as you move up the educational level, starting with post-high school graduates. So you've got this gap both from a race standpoint, race and ethnicity standpoint, as well as a gender standpoint. And the problem gets worse as you move up the educational ladder. And then we've got COVID, where that has been felt disproportionately by women and people of color, resulting in those pay gaps, predicted to get worse. And then when you layer the gender with the race and ethnicity pay gaps, that pay gap is exacerbated. In 2019, the National Women's Law Center reported that pay gaps translate to an annual median loss of $24,000 approximately for Black women, 29,000 approximately for Hispanic women and 8,000 for Asian women when you compare it to their white non-Hispanic male counterparts. So the bottom line is from either race, ethnicity, or gender lines, the pay gap persists, and it gets bigger the higher you go up on the educational level, and perhaps with COVID, the gap is getting worse. So, and this is of course despite the fact that there's been certainly federal laws on the books since the 60s that prohibited both gender and race ethnicity pay discrimination. One other item I wanted to note is this persistent problem also is this alluding to this undergirding diversity issue. In other words, where white men are holding a disproportionate percentage of higher paying jobs. So with that sort of overlay of the problem, let's shift to a discussion about pay equity, legislative trends over the past few years. So Andrea, can you discuss what has transpired and what trends we are seeing internationally, federally, and at the state level?
Yes, definitely. And I want to invite folks to put questions in the Q&A box or the chat throughout, and we're happy to kind of make this a discussion as much as possible. It's in a really exciting time for innovation around closing gender and racial wage gaps. In the last 5 to 7 years, at least, we've seen a lot of movement, most notably at the state level and abroad, to really strengthen protections against pay discrimination, but also to pass laws that are more focused on debiasing employer systems as opposed to debiasing minds. We need to do both, but recognizing that proactive measures from employers can really go a long way. In just the last 5 years at the state level, we've seen 19 states from Alabama to Illinois to Nebraska pass legislation closing loopholes in their state equal pay laws so that they have a bit more teeth. For example, we've seen states increase the damages available to those who experience pay discrimination, or they are tightening up the defenses that employers can use to justify an otherwise unlawful pay gap. We're increasingly seeing states include race amongst the categories covered by the equal pay law or other protected categories, and not just sex, which has been historically the focus of equal pay laws. And states have really been leading on banning employers' reliance on salary history to set pay, since we know that that perpetuates wage gaps. And they've also been leading on requiring greater transparency around salary ranges for a position. At the federal level, just to give a quick synopsis of what's happening there, the Paycheck Fairness Act is one really big piece of legislation around equal pay that has passed the US House, but not yet the Senate. The bill mirrors a lot of the measures we've seen passing the states to close loopholes in the Equal Pay Act, to ban reliance on salary history, to generally increase pay transparency, and also includes a requirement that employers report pay broken down by race, ethnicity, and sex to the EEOC. And that last measure, that pay data requirement and disclosure requirement, is something we've really seen take off at the international level, and oftentimes in much bolder ways. Countries from Australia to Canada to the UK to Spain to frankly much of Northern and Western Europe have all taken steps to require analyses and reporting and either government or public disclosure of compensation by gender. So that's a really exciting trend at the international level, and just seeing at the international level more of an focus on ensuring that employers have to kind of prove that they are following equal pay laws, that they are doing, paying people fairly to begin with, instead of putting the onus on individual workers to bring complaints. And that's an exciting movement we're seeing at that level.
Great. Well, let's dig into the pay data reporting and disclosures. Maya, can you elaborate on the trends in pay data and reporting disclosure requirements?
Sure. Thanks, Joanna. So, I think what we're seeing are similar trends at the federal, state, and international level. And all of those things, as Andrea mentioned, are sort of looking to each other, being influenced by each other, and helping to sort of push things forward. But on a very basic level, what we are seeing are requirements that companies conduct some sort of pay equity evaluation or assessment. I think at the state level and at the federal level, we're seeing it include gender and race, but at the international level, a lot of it has largely been focused so far on gender, although that might be starting to change. The next thing that we're starting to see is having companies collect the data and conduct those assessments and then reporting them to some sort of an agency, a state agency, federal agency, national level agency in other countries. Sometimes that data, that compensation data in particular, is kept confidential, but other measures are made public. Or there is an additional requirement that companies report some sort of top-level wage gap data publicly on their websites, or the government makes that information publicly available on their websites. You know, Andrea mentioned that at the federal level here in the US, we had movement for a while on the EEO-1 pay data collection. That was eventually halted again. And that prospects for the Paycheck Fairness Act in the Senate are uncertain given the reality of circumstances there. So what we wanted to spend some time discussing today are what is happening on pay data reporting and disclosures at the state level that has sort of learned from the battles at the federal level, and that's sort of inspiring, again, sort of next steps at the federal level, and then go into detail on some international models that we're seeing that are also part of the conversation about what should happen next here in the US. So
I wanted to, raise a question from our audience, sort of tying into sort of what laws are going on. With the makeup of Congress now, what are the obstacles to passing the Paycheck Fairness Act? Maya or Andrea?
That's a great question. The Paycheck Fairness Act has sort of become politicized to a certain extent over the last several years, although you would think that equal pay and measures to promote equal pay in and of themselves shouldn't be controversial. Right now, as you all know, there is a 50-50 split in the Senate. And just last week, the Senate blocked a procedural motion to move forward with a vote on the Paycheck Fairness Act that really split along party lines. So some of the objections that we've heard articulated is that, the Paycheck Fairness Act isn't necessary. We already have equal pay laws, that part of this is a cultural problem. It's not up to employers, that somehow it's going to hurt businesses. It's really just a boon for trial lawyers, and that it's going to prevent people from paying their employees bonuses. None of those are really sort of reality-based objections. I think in terms of the specific question as to what can be done, I think what's really important, and we've seen this from progress in the states, and Andrea can speak to this, is really hearing the stories of people who are dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis, whether it's employees who uncover a pay disparity and are working with their employer to try to resolve it, it's employers who are changing their own practices and, it's not putting them out of business because they want to provide an equitable and fair workplace. And in many cases in the states, they have worked with advocates to ensure that the laws that are passed are ones that people agree are going to advance pay equity. So, a lot of the rhetoric, I think, is blocking and placing obstacles in the path of some real progress if people were just able to stop and talk about the reality of how this affects people. Andrea, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I could chime in on that point about how these laws are impacting people and benefiting employers. One trend that I didn't get a chance to mention amongst states that I think is really exciting is around the salary range transparency. Initially we saw a number of states, we actually have 15 now that have passed bans on relying on salary history, with Nevada being the most recent state to join that movement. And those bills, the salary history bills, are passing with bipartisan support. I think a lot of people were just getting in their gut, how unfair the salary history question is. And increasingly employers are realizing how this is an unnecessary and harmful question to their business as well, because it perpetuates wage gaps. And what we're seeing in response to the salary history movement is an increasing number of states now also requiring salary range transparency for a number of reasons. One is that as employers started to shift away from asking applicants for their salary history, they started instead to post the salary range for a position because they found that it was a more efficient and effective way to match with applicants. Or employers, when they didn't ask a salary history question, started asking, what are your salary expectations? Is a question that is okay to ask under a salary history ban. But research has shown us that the wage gaps that arise in negotiations when applicants are not given information about the context of the negotiation, about the salary range, wage gaps arise. And so if we provide the salary range in those negotiations, that helps to close the wage gap. So, there was some initial hesitancy amongst employers when these laws were moving. And we're starting to see it with every year, more and more employers showing up and saying, this is a good hiring practice. This saves us time, helps us match more quickly. And we now have, I think, 5 states that have passed, with most recently Connecticut and Nevada, have passed a requirement that employers provide the salary range to applicants early on in the hiring process, and increasingly to employees as well throughout their tenure, because it's an important way to just make sure that you're being paid fairly and to be able to talk to the employer about what's going on.
Pretty consistently in polling, equal pay has a lot of support. People are very supportive of reforms to ensure that there is equal pay between, on a gender level and for race and ethnicity. And as Andrea mentioned, these sort of transparency measures are also very popular because people understand them sort of on how it impacts their lives. And they see that it makes a difference. So I think part of trying to move some of these reforms forward is focusing on how popular they are and that they sort of are making a difference both for individuals and in companies, that they are creating workforces that are more engaged, more productive, and strengthen their relationships with their employers because they trust them more.
Well, I wanted to discuss, really on the state level for the moment. If Andrea, if you can elaborate on some sort of state examples, I know you had alluded to it a moment ago, but if you could, sort of drill down on some of the states in terms of what their pay data and reporting disclosure requirements would be.
Yeah, this has been, all of it's exciting. Another exciting transparency. I think we kind of saw the initial trend was around states and localities, not just states, but localities as well, requiring state or city contractors to affirmatively report employee pay data as a condition of applying for a contract. That was kind of the initial movement we saw. I know New Mexico and Albuquerque were some of the initial jurisdictions to take that on several years ago. One more recent example is New Jersey, which in 2018 passed a law that requires public works and service contractors to report to the Labor Department the number of employees and their pay broken down by gender, race, and compensation, and job category and pay bands. So similar to that EEO1 model that we're familiar with. But thus far that law is just focused on contractors. And then this year, we saw California become one of the first states to require pay data reporting for private employers writ large, which was really exciting. California's law follows very closely the EEO1 component to pay data collection that Maya referenced, that was challenged under the Trump administration, and requires private employers with 100 or more employees to report annually pay data, again, broken down by gender, race, ethnicity, and those pay bands and job categories. And that information goes to the State Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And then I would say kind of the very close in time, but a sort of newer trend that we're seeing in Illinois, which I think just at the end of last year passed legislation to take a slightly bolder approach, and that requires that similar EEO1 type data, pay data, be reported by employers, but also that the data be made available to the public. So going a step farther and starting to get closer to some of our international examples of requiring some level of public disclosure. And this law again applies to employers with 100 or more employees. It's if they provide that pay data information, they can get an equal pay registration certificate from the state. So that's an exciting new model that, again, is just getting going, but we're following closely.
Great. And I just wanted to add, I think in California, you know, it's kind of what we will probably see sort of trending, it seems, is adding in the sort of non-binary gender with respect to the sort of EEO1 style component 2 reporting, which is obviously new. You know, another thing I thought was kind of interesting about California is that, you know, I think some people think, well, it's for California employers. It's actually really broad. It's, yes, you need to be, you know, an employer with at least 100 employees, but as long as you have one California employee, you know, you could potentially get tagged on. And the way that the Department of Fair Employment and Housing appears to have construed that is that it's just one California employee. And with sort of COVID going on, the remote working, it's really adding kind of a wrinkle to that. And so, you know, they've basically indicated that if you are an employee assigned to a California location, you know, that would be included. So if you are, you have one employee kind of working remotely in California, that potentially could put you on the hook, and vice versa. If you are, you know, you're sort of in California, but none of your employees are in California but they report to California, that would be potentially included too. So it kind of adds some interesting complications, but it is potentially very broad, that California law. The other thing I wanted to add with respect to Illinois is, you know, Illinois, there's a component 2 style reporting, but also there's like a statement where you have to affirmatively state that you're in compliance. And you know, how and how often pay decisions are made, what basis the compensation is set, and this affirmative statement that I am in compliance and not, you know, so that sort of, it sort of really puts the onus on companies to actually do the analysis and explain what their analysis is. It's not just enough to just submit your pay data. So I think that's really going to encourage, whether by stick or by carrot, encourage employers to take a look and see what their, you know, demographics and, you know, pay data is showing, so they can know, like, you know, you got to know what it is you're reporting. And I think that the Illinois law is going to encourage employers to really, you know, drill down on that. I wanted to interject a question, another question from the audience, was how do we best fix these inequities? Legislate our way into the solution? Reporting this inequity awareness is step one. What should follow? And this kind of, you know, dovetails to sort of what we're talking about. So the gist of the question is, how are we going to fix this? And obviously that's a thorny and complicated question, but I wanted to present that and see what your thoughts are. Andrea or Maya?
Yeah, I can just start with some initial reflections. I think this is definitely a all hands on deck type issue, and that, you know, it's not just legislation, but you know, we need to be doing a lot of culture work and awareness raising. But I do get really excited by the increase in legislative measures we've seen in recent years that, like I said, go to debiasing employer systems instead of minds. And I think they've played a role in also influencing culture. So, you know, when Massachusetts passed the first salary history ban in 2016, that started a whole national conversation about, oh, I mean, do we actually need this information? And what are we doing if we ask for somebody's salary history? How is this harming people? We've seen a lot of employers voluntarily stop the practice as a result all across the country, even if there isn't a salary history ban in place. And that's really important. And I just think there's so much that we kind of have taken for granted as this is just the way it is, that we really need to take a step back and look at what these seemingly innocuous practices are doing and see how we can stop that. Because, you know, another big piece of it is the mind piece, is the biases, and that is really difficult and to root out. But we know we can take pretty immediate action with some of these processes questions. And for example, in the salary history question, we're already seeing research from the states that have passed these bans showing that they are actively helping to close the wage gap. And they haven't been around for that long, so that's pretty exciting to see that research so quickly. and really makes me think this is an important place to be focusing our attention.
Great, right. And it does seem like it's a solution that has many different sort of ways to attack the problem. And focusing on one or sort of putting all your eggs in one basket isn't a good idea. There's a bunch of different ways that can help solve the problem, and sort of collectively doing all of them and pushing, advocating for all of them, it seems like is the way to get there. Okay, so I wanted to, we were talking about sort of state level. I wanted to ask you, Maya, if you could discuss pay data reporting and disclosures specifically internationally in the UK, EU, and Australia.
Sure. So as Andrea mentioned, there's been a lot of movement at the international level in Europe particularly on these issues of pay data reporting and disclosures. So in the interest of time, what I thought I would do is pick out sort of 3 very different examples from across the world, and give us some detail about how they are approaching this issue. And then I also wanted to highlight a new European Commission proposal that is focused on pay transparency and includes several of the measures that we've been talking about today. So the first one, and maybe one of the more well-known ones I wanted to talk about, is the UK law that was enacted in 2017 and went into effect in 2018. It requires public and private employers with 250 employees or more to annually submit their compensation data based on sex to a UK agency. That information is put into a database that the government created, and it's publicly searchable and accessible. In addition, companies are required to post 4 sort of wage gap measures on their public websites, again, so anyone is able to access that information. And in particular, the information that has to be provided is sort of the mean and median hourly rate of pay, the bonus pay paid to male and female employees, the proportion of male and female employees who were paid bonuses, and the proportions of male and female employees in these 4 pay bands. So the purpose is to sort of give a picture of base compensation and a comparison between male and female employees, bonuses between male and female employees, and then sort of the distribution within the pay range available at the company. The government developed a guidance for employers regarding collecting and calculating the data that has to be submitted, and there's a portal on the website. So that's been going on for 2 years now. Reporting was halted last year during the pandemic, and it was recently restarted. But a lot of people, media, companies have gone into that database, have pulled up the data and run comparisons between companies within industries, geographical areas in the UK, all of which has really started this big conversation in the country about gender wage gaps, about occupational segregation, and is helping to drive some change forward. One of the other features of the UK example is that many companies were driven to sort of, in addition to their data, submit plans and reports sort of explaining the results of their analyses and sort of what steps that they were taking to address the gaps that they uncovered. So the UK is thinking about next steps on that law. One of them might be potentially to require those action plans so that companies are thinking about not just reporting that data, but how to address it. And then potentially including some race and ethnicity-based measures as well. So the next one I wanted to highlight that takes a slightly different approach is a law that was passed in France in 2018. And that covers sort of a greater range of companies. So it's companies with more than 50 employees are required to measure their gender wage gaps and report on the steps to remedy any wage gaps using a tool created by the French government. So it's sort of this 100-point scale, and companies have to use that to basically evaluate themselves and report the results. So they are required to evaluate wage differences between men and women, which constitutes 40% of the score, but also pay differences between men and pay increase differences between men and women, differences in annual promotions. And an interesting factor, which we haven't necessarily seen in other places, is pay increases upon return from maternity leave. So that's trying to get at this issue of the fact that women still shoulder the majority of responsibility for caregiving and the impact that that has on their career advancement and wage gaps, and the number of women in the top 10 earners of the company. So again, trying to get a sense of both wage gaps and seniority and occupations. The last example I'll highlight is from Australia, where private sector employers with 100 and more employees have to annually report pay data to a specialized gender equality agency in Australia. So it's report on the gender composition of the workforce, base pay and all forms of compensation, and a number of other measures, including flexibility to address caregiving responsibilities. So the reports with the information other than pay are made publicly available by the government for each company. The pay data is aggregated by industry and put on a government website that's also publicly available. So it's sort of splitting the difference between requiring collection and submission of the data, but then allowing some of it to be publicly accessible as well.
Great.
So,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Keep going.
No. I was just going to talk about the European Commission proposal, but happy to stop and take questions.
Well, you know, let me hold off on that because the question is really not tied to what you're talking about. It's an earlier question. So if you want to, you know, please continue. My apologies.
Okay. Sure, I'll go through this quickly. So this is a proposal from a couple months ago from the European Commission, specifically focused on addressing pay transparency within organizations. So it would require, there are a number of measures in it, so I'll focus on the reporting measures first. Okay. It requires employers with at least 250 workers to make publicly available and accessible their pay gap data, their gender pay gap data within their organization. And then internally, they have to provide that information to employees, but also broken out by categories of workers doing the same job or a job of equal value. If the company finds that there's a gender wage gap of at least 5%, then they have, if they can't justify those gaps, then they have to perform a pay equity assessment, but in consultation with any worker representative groups at the company. So a couple of other transparency measures in that proposal, employers have to provide information on salary ranges for job applicants. They can't use salary history in hiring or to set compensation. And workers have the right to request information from their employer about the salary level for their job and the jobs and similar jobs or jobs of sort of performing equal work. So there are several measures bundled into that proposal, and obviously it has to make its way through the sort of European Parliament and Commission before it can become law. But that's something that's generating a lot of discussion and interest, including here in the US.
Great. Okay, so we had a, thank you, Maya. We had a question. Hold on, let me get through it. The question is, can you make state salary history and wage gap data available? So I think the question is asking about reported, reported data to the agencies, if that can be made publicly available. That's the question, I think, as I understand it.
So I included a fact sheet. So this might have been referenced when I was mentioning the research that's come out recently about how salary history bands are helping close the wage gap. So I included a fact sheet in the chat that cites to that research.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so going back across the pond, Mike, can you explain, the SEC ESG disclosures and how that fits into pay equity? So I know there's been a lot of talk about ESG, DEI, and sort of connecting the dots between that and pay equity. I don't know is apparent to everyone.
Yeah. So putting aside the ongoing conversations about the EEO-1 pay data collection, Paycheck Fairness Act, and other issues, there is still a lot of discussion at the legislative and regulatory level in the US about sort of where the next steps are. And as you mentioned, this discussion about greater transparency around wages is dovetailing with more conversation now, especially with this new administration, about greater transparency around diversity measures, diversity demographic, workforce demographic information broken out by race and gender, and sort of the connection between the two. So this is where the conversation about the SEC and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG measures, comes into play. So on the administrative and the regulatory side, there have been efforts going back for several years, but more recently in 2016 and 2019, for ESG, for the SEC to require greater ESG reporting, and for those measures to include more data specifically on diversity and compensation information. That was sort of renewed recently with the change in administration and SEC commissioners who are very interested in this issue, particularly greater transparency around diversity and compensation information. So the relevant committee in the House, or one of them, is the House Financial Services Committee, and they recently held a hearing specifically on pay equity because they're very interested in the issue of gender and racial wealth gaps, and gender and racial pay gaps are a driver of those wealth gaps. And there's a lot of conversation about the role of transparency and sort of the connection to ESG disclosures or other kinds of disclosures in public and filings that public companies are required to make. So the most recent sort of effort around greater ESG reporting in the US was a proposal from the SEC in 2019. They ultimately did not adopt a very fulsome rule. What they ended up landing on was some reporting on human capital, but they declined to provide a definition of that term or any specific guidelines for the disclosure. So it won't surprise you to know that there was a recent sort of evaluation of that reporting, and it didn't include any hard data, and it was just really sort of hard to tell what exactly was going on with the company because they didn't have to report any specific data. House Financial Services Committee has recently sort of passed out of committee 2 pieces of legislation that is trying to get at those issues of greater reporting and transparency around diversity information and also sort of ESG reporting. So there's one bill, HR 1187, I can put it in the chat, that basically would require any issues of securities to disclose ESG metrics and their connection to, their business strategy. And it would require rulemaking by the SEC on sort of defining what those measures are and the information that has to be reported. And that's going to the floor soon of the House. That as yet doesn't include any specific measures on pay, but that's certainly sort of been part of the conversation on the S part of ESG disclosures. There's another bill that was released from that committee, which is called the Diversity and Inclusion Data Accountability and Transparency Act, which would require entities that are regulated by the SEC to disclose diversity data, policies, and practices to those agencies. So part of what's driving a lot of this and the ESG disclosures in particular is the argument that information about the demographic conversation of a workforce with regard to gender, race, ethnicity, and other measures and compensation data is, of material value to investors as they're considering where to put their money and assessing the risks. So that is sort of in concert with a movement from some activist shareholders over the last several years to encourage companies to self-report the results of to conduct pay equity analyses and self-report the results as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maya. I believe there was a question just sort of what pay data reporting is currently in effect. And I think a lot of that was sort of answered already, but I wanted to just sort of make sure we had a complete answer on that. Obviously, we had the EEO-1 component 2 data reporting that was in effect just for a brief period of time, initiated under the Obama administration, halted under the Trump administration, and after some litigation, basically we had 2017 and 2018 component 2 reporting required. So right now it's no longer required, but obviously we've got President Biden, who was VP for Obama, and Biden's appointment of Jenny Yang, who as the former commissioner and chair of the EOC, advocated for component 2. She's now heading the OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program. So component 2 may be returning. In the meantime, component 1 is there. And component 2 is just the basic, obviously, demographics data of what positions everybody's in based on their race, ethnicity, and job classifications. And so, I think kind of underlying that still remains, even if you aren't doing component 2, is this undergirding diversity issue that is going to be apparent. And, obviously in the vacuum of component 2 reporting being gone, Andrew had talked about California's SB 973, which is in effect, it started that the first year of reporting was this year. Illinois hasn't gone into effect yet. The law just passed, I think, last year. So in terms of pay data reporting, other than the EEO1 component 2 reporting that was only in effect for reporting the calendar years 2017 and 2018, we had California just this past year, but we're going to see more of that as starting basically now, and there is this potential of component 2 reporting returning under the Biden administration. We had another audience question member asking, what are some of the best practices for answering questions from employees and managers for perceived pay equity issues? Andrea, Maya, do you want to answer that one? So what are some of the best practices for answering questions from employees and managers for perceived pay equity issues?
I can start, Andrea. I think part of the issue, and this goes back to the question of transparency, is there is not only a lack of information about pay itself, and there may be policies in place that prohibit or penalize people for talking about their pay with each other. But I think there is, in many cases, also a lack of transparency about how compensation is set. So that is sort of part of the issue many times, is people don't understand how pay is set. And so if they discover that a coworker that they feel is in the same job is getting paid more than them, or more than they would assume that person would be paid, and there's a perception that it's unfair, some of it is they just don't understand why that's the case, right? How is that compensation set? What are the factors that go into it? Is it education, experience, skills, all those kinds of things? They don't have a sense of maybe the compensation structure of the company. So if you're in particular kinds of jobs or jobs at a particular level, there isn't a lot of clarity about what a salary range is for that job. So people have no way of judging sort of where they are, where they fall on that when they start to make comparisons to coworkers. And then another issue is maybe lack of clarity around how bonuses or commissions or other forms of compensation are awarded as well. Like, what are the criteria for them? So I think one way to sort of get ahead of some of those issues, which can be tricky conversations, is to think about how to be more transparent from the beginning about how compensation is set and the factors that go into that, so that people understand, it helps them understand better where they are and where others in similar jobs might be.
I wanted to add to that, just alluding to the lack of transparency that employees and managers may perceive. Part of it is as a practical matter, sort of from the management level. I don't know that it is all that known exactly how their methodology, plays out in, some of it is very, intuitive, if you will, where people who are making compensation decisions, they're kind of eyeballing it, and the kind of metrics and sort of thoughtful analysis isn't there. I think this really like dovetails into so the next topic that I really wanted to get into, which is basically conducting the pay equity audit, is the kind of transparency that employees and managers may be wanting to see are going to come from doing that actual analysis to figure out, well, how did we decide it? What are the numbers? What have we been doing? Because a lot of it hasn't been kind of quantified, I think. So, we've been talking about pay data reporting, public disclosure, salary range transparency. They're all helpful to this momentum to achieve pay equity. But pay equity audits really adds to that, and then it's going to provide you the tools to actually address the pay equity within a particular organization. Trusaic had sponsored a 2019 Harvard business study on pay equity issues, and it was respondents both in the UK and the US. In part was to sort of compare the two, dealing with companies that were typically 100 or more, like 81% of the companies were 100 or more employees. My apologies, I've misspoken. 90% are more than 100 employees, and more than 80% are companies with 1,000 employees or more. So anyway, larger companies, roughly half national, regional versus global, and primarily made up of managers, senior managers, and executives. And one of the things that really kind of echoed what we were talking about earlier is that 54% of the UK respondents cited pay data reporting from the government as a requirement, as a key external driver for them to actually perform the pay equity analysis, versus 28% of their US counterparts. And notably, this is a survey conducted in 2019, really sort of pre-California SB 973, for example. And so for the most part, the US doesn't have with the one caveat for the EEO1 component 2 for a brief spell, the US really didn't have a pay data reporting requirement, and the UK did. And basically it was a 2-to-1 ratio of whether or not pay data reporting requirement was a key driver for them to actually conduct the pay analysis. And it makes sense, because if you are an employer and you're submitting this pay data reporting to a government agency, don't you want to know what you just submitted, what that data shows? Because it's just really like the raw gaps that you're reporting to the government. So you're going to want to know what that means. And so, part of wanting to achieve pay equity and also finding out where you actually are as an organization in terms of pay discrimination, or how close you are to achieving pay equity or not achieving pay equity, is to conduct a pay equity audit, which is basically taking your workforce data covering a certain period of time, and the scope. If you're like a big company, maybe you're doing it by divisions or what have you. If you're multinational, and you're obviously going to have to consider sort of the issues that are jurisdictionally specific, but you're basically looking at the workforce data. And, of course, you're doing a baseline, whether you're looking at it from a gender perspective or a race, ethnicity perspective, looking at everybody's wages, hours, and their positions. And then overlaying on top of that, unlike a pay data report that you're going to submit under, say, component 2 or SB 973, California SB 973, you're actually also looking at other job-related factors that is essentially going to account potentially for, why Susie is getting paid less than John, for example, on a workforce scale. And it's going to help really shed light, like, how do we, we're kind of trying to have a discussion of how do we solve the problem? Well, one of the key elements is to conduct the analytics to figure out where is your problem that's unique to you, not necessarily globally from a society, but your organization. You start there. Where are there gaps? And so when you are conducting that analysis,
you end up being able to figure out whether there's actually a pay disparity when you're considering things like sort of legitimate job related factors like seniority, for example. The reason why this person gets paid more than this other person is this first person works has been with the company for 6 years, and this person just started, even though it's the same position. Very rational, legitimate reason why one person gets paid more than another. So that's, this kind of, very math-centric statistical analysis is necessary to figure out, well, is that apparent pay gap really just a much smaller pay disparity, or maybe no pay disparity? So you're going to look at that, and it's going to answer, is there, where there's evidence of pay discrimination, and also how this pay discrimination might, vary depending on, particular job positions. Maybe it's sort of, there's a cluster of pay gap in a certain area. Maybe it's just new people that are coming, but there's no pay discrimination for ongoing employees. So there's all these sort of permutations of things that a pay equity analysis will actually afford to the employer. And it really, in sort of drilling down the mechanics of it, is going to help the employer identify where the root causes are. And it really gives the employer the tools to go, hey, we have a pay disparity problem among our, like a particular location, a division of that company, or a certain subset, but it's able to sort of look at the details and then go, what we're going to do? We're going to remediate this problem. We're going to, for example, make an adjustment to salaries, in a particular group cohort where the pay disparity was there. So these are the things you can do, but you need to have the metrics to do it. And you could also figure out, like, and kind of alluding to that HBR survey, as I mentioned, another thing that that the survey found was the importance of salary histories being a key driver to the pay gap. And as Andrea had mentioned, that is, it's just basically perpetuating previous pay discrimination. You're just bringing it on by using that as a platform for that employee's new salary. So, what the survey showed, it was like 61% of employers who conducted pay equity audits found that relying on the history is a key driver to gender pay gaps, much larger than those who didn't conduct any pay equity audit. But importantly, in both cases, they recognize the import of salary history being a driver to pay gaps. Because typically a lot, at least historically, employers would say, hey, what were you getting paid? And using that to figure out, well, how much will I need to pay more to get this person to come to the company? Okay, let's see. Okay, so with that, I wanted to, also open it up to Maya and Andrea if you had additional thoughts about best practices regarding, questions for perceived pay equity issues. And I actually want to also mention that if you do the pay equity audit, you'll actually have the information to, basically provide more transparency to your employees as to what's going on. It also is of value to tell your employees, hey, we are evaluating where we are in terms of pay equity. That really communicates to your employers that it's really important, and and it's not just to address potential regulatory or litigation risk, but it's attractive to employees to understand that you're doing this, whether or not you're required to do it, but that you actually want to look at yourself in the mirror and say, where are we as an organization? How true are we in terms of achieving pay equity? And that's very attractive, not just from talent attraction, but employee retention, but also, company reputation. These are all things that, whether it's, legally required, just from a social standpoint, it's really, impactful to employees to know that you actually want to figure this out about yourself as an organization, and based on what you figure out, what you're going to do about it, and communicating that to your employees seems like that's the way to go towards one more prong in the sort of all hands on deck approach to achieving pay equity. Any additional thoughts, Maya or Andrea?
No, I'll just say that I, agree particularly with the last points you were making about how companies can show that they genuinely see sort of this issue of fair compensation as a company value and demonstrate it through these pay equity audits. Because I think, pay equity is one of those issues where culture is driving legal change and institutional change. And it's also sort of working the other way as well, that the legal change is then driving institutional change. And, this is an issue that has really gained a lot of sort of awareness in the public perception and education over the last 10 years. And particularly with, the US women's national soccer team's lawsuit, it's just an issue that is like catapulted into public awareness. And increasingly what we're seeing, it is an important value for people as consumers as to what a company is doing to advance fairness and pay equity. It's an issue for all workers, but particularly, potential hires in younger workers who see this as a very important value, corporate value, and want to see that and want to see what steps companies are taking. And then I think in the last year in particular, as companies came out with statements about their commitment to racial equity and racial justice, like people, it's been a year now, so people want to see, what does that mean in practice? Like, what are you actually doing to advance this issue? Because, of course, the wage gap discussion isn't just about gender, it's also about race.
Right. Andrea, do you want to add any additional thoughts?
I just want to call attention that both Maya and I dropped some fact sheets in the chat about employer practices for advancing equal pay, and then citing specific examples of what employers have done. And one thing that I think is important that's mentioned in the first fact sheet about kind of laying out what employers can do to achieve equal pay. Obviously, the pay equity audit is a really important piece of that. And I think sometimes that a piece that gets overlooked in the discussion of these audits is the importance of not looking just job to job, but where people land, at the highest paying jobs and the lowest paying jobs, and looking really at those low paying jobs and see who's making up those jobs, both based on gender, based on race, and other categories. And that's something that employers should be actively thinking about and disclosing, and not just saying, okay, we don't have a wage gap job to job, but saying, looking at that gap, because that is super important. And really crucial way tool for closing the wage gap is increasing the minimum wage, increasing the pay of those who are paid the lowest paid, because it is more often than not women of color in those jobs. So hoping that can really be an important part of these conversations about what it is to really do an audit and really think about how you can close the wage gap.
Great. Well, Andrea, thank you. Maya, thank you for this great discussion that we've had, and thank you to our audience for attending today. We hope you've enjoyed today's discussion, advancing pay equity, pay transparency, and proactive employer efforts. It looks like we were able to answer all questions identified in both the chat box and the Q&A. So, but if there's any other additional questions, you can reach out to us. This concludes today's session, and enjoy the rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.